What happens when you ask questions about the Bible? For example, in Genesis chapter 4, when Cain kills Abel. Why did Cain and Abel bring an offering to God in the first place? Why was Cain's offering rejected for seemingly no clear reason in the text? Why is Cain afraid of being killed by people when presumably him and his parents are the only humans on the earth? For years, I did not know how to ask these kinds of questions when I studied the Bible. But these kinds of questions can take our understanding of the Bible to another level. So let's jump into Genesis chapter 4. We are in Genesis chapter 4. Ladies and gentlemen, the main summary statement of this chapter is that Cain murders Abel. Bummer. Cain is exiled east of the garden to Nod, builds a city, has descendants. Adam and Eve have a child to replace Abel. His name is Seth. If I'm going to use two words to summarize this chapter, it's going to be favor and bloodshed. Favor and bloodshed. Let's ask some questions about this text. Now, Adam knew Eve, his wife. What does it mean to know? Well, I think you're going to know what that means, because she conceives and she bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. You know, and you kind of credit God, but you're still like the main character. So, verse 1, why does the text tell us what Eve says about giving birth to Cain? There's nothing that's going to be said about Abel, and she bore his brother Abel. And she's not naming Cain per se in this statement. She's just making a statement about the fact that she has gotten a man who happens to be Cain. The question becomes, who names Cain? But when I say, why does the text give us a statement from Eve about Cain? I ask that because I also want to ask, how might this relate to the rest of the story and shed light on what might be happening in this story? Also, why is it specifically that Eve has gotten a man? We go, well, because Cain is a man. This is the first human being born, through Eve, her womb, her first offspring. This is wonderful. She's going to make a big deal about it. Well, I just want to think about how this might relate to Genesis 3:16. Go read Genesis 3:16. And is this possibly her way? I'm just asking questions here, okay? Because it says in Genesis 3:16 that her desire will be contrary to her husband. And is this possibly, besides saying, whoa, I got a man, I produced an offspring, is this also a way for Eve to not need Adam in the picture, to produce on her own, and now she has her own man to oversee and rule? And some of you might think, well, that's a little too far, my friend. But when you look at what it is that's going to be, how Eve and Adam are now somewhat at odds in their relationship, and there's tension, and it's been fractured, you wonder if this is not just a statement about Cain, but a statement about Eve in relationship to just man. But I digress. Who named Cain and Abel? And you go, who cares? Because here's why I care. Because the text tells us when Adam names things. And so far in Genesis 2 and 3 specifically, there's no hiding the fact that Adam has the authority and the God-given ability to name the animals, and even woman, and then Eve in Genesis 3. So all of a sudden, Cain and Abel just have names. And I think that's intentional, to maybe make a deeper point about what's happening and the rift between Adam and Eve. But the text doesn't tell us who names. At the end, though, and you go, why is this important? Because at the end of this chapter, it will tell us Eve named Seth. Eve named Seth. And again, she bore his brother Abel. Now, Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain was a worker of the ground. Okay? Two different fellas. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. Okay? Question: is it important to note that Cain is chronologically, are we seeing the events unfold? Is Cain the first to bring an offering, and then Abel follows? Because it says, and Abel also brought of the firstborn. And you go, well, possibly it could be both of them at the same time, but it starts with Cain as the main figure bringing the offering, and then it just tags on Abel. Not to say, and both brothers brought, Cain first, then Abel. Is that important? Possibly. Also, did God require them to bring offerings? You and I assume, looking back in hindsight, knowing the Levitical system and sacrifices and temple and Jesus, we're going, yeah, of course this was prescribed. It doesn't say that in the text, which doesn't mean it's not. But it's also probably making a statement about the fact that it's not important to know whether or not it was required or not. Just did God require them to bring these offerings? I almost called them free will offerings. Or was this of their own free will? Was something? Did something prompt them to do this, or did God instruct them to do this? Something to think about. The way verse 2 transitions into verse 3 in the course of time, it makes it seem as though we don't see offerings up to this point. This may well be the very first offering of what someone has in God's world and bringing that to God. This may well be the first time that happens. So also, Abel brought of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. Gotta love them fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. His offering. If God did not explicitly instruct or command this offering, my question is, how did they know to do this? How did they know specifically to bring the fruit from the ground, or for Abel to bring the firstborn and the fat of his flock? And what compelled them to bring God gifts? And then the question becomes, if God chooses one and rejects another, let's just assume it's not arbitrary. There's a reason, there's a standard that one of them fails to meet. Then therefore, that might give us reason to conclude, possibly, that God did instruct this if there's a clear standard to meet and a standard by which it'll be accepted or rejected. Also, again, were there any offerings up to this point? Because it just says in the course of time, as if to make this, when I read it, it almost seems like a new thing. Otherwise, it would say one time they brought an offering, or, one of the times they were bringing offerings, but this is, I'm reading this as this is a brand new thing. Also, if this is a new, let's just say it's not a new thing at this point in human history. At this point in the narrative, we have not seen this concept of someone bringing an offering to God. Where did this come from? When was it established? Was this the product of sin? Like, is the offering as part of a way to deal with this issue of sin, and now this is what happens because of sin? Or was this part of the ideal and the way God created all things good, and offerings were part of that? How does the transition from exile in Genesis 3 to this story help us understand offerings being brought to God? Is this the result of exile? Is it a way to deal with exile and sin? Or is this, irregardless of the exile and sin, the way God intended for humans to relate to him, even in a good world? But for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. So Cain was very angry and his face fell, sunk in. Frustration, bitterness settling in, jealousy, grinding of the teeth. I'm reading a lot into that, but you know what I mean. Face falling as a result of anger. This is not a happy-go-lucky, hey, Abel, high five, buddy. This is, well, the question I have is, did God accept Abel's offering because he accepted Abel first? Or did God accept Abel because he accepted Abel's offering first? And the same question applies to Cain. Did God reject Cain because his offering was trash? Or did God reject the offering of Cain because Cain, not a great fella, and he had issues, and God rejected him in that moment? Is it that God starts with the person, then the offering? Or God starts with the offering, then the person? Either way, the offering is an extension of the person. For God to accept or reject one is to accept or reject the person offering it. So, something to think about. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry?" 4 words no one wants to hear when they're ticked off. I promise you that. And why has your face fallen? No one likes to be prodded when they're angry. Why are you mad? What happened? I don't want to talk to you right now, buddy. Get out of my face. So, verse 6. Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? Does Cain actually, verse 7, sorry. If you do well, will you not be accepted? Obviously, Cain has an understanding of what God means, though for us, outsiders looking in, we're going, what does that mean? Will you not be accepted if you do well? If you don't do well, sin is crouching at the door. Oof. Its desires contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Several questions. Sin is crouching at the door, okay? Is sin only crouching at the door if Cain does not do well? Or is sin crouching at the door regardless of what Cain does, and God is just warning Cain, hey, do well, because sin is crouching at the door, or it will destroy you. In other words, this crouching at the door on the part of sin, is it conditioned upon Cain doing well or not doing well? Also, does Cain really have the ability to rule over sin in this situation? Or does God know Cain ultimately is powerless and helpless and he needs to call it to me? Or does God actually, has God given Cain the free will ability, the human ability to, in this moment, not let sin overtake him? That's going to divide. A lot of people will divide at that question. And your theology is showing. So why is this moment the first time we see sin explicitly referenced? Like, why didn't the previous story involve the word sin? Though the concept was there, the idea was underlying in that story. Why is this the first time the word sin is used? It's interesting, right? Verse 8, you're going to see that Cain didn't say a thing. God goes, hey, buddy, don't let your temper get the best of you. Cain doesn't say anything. Cain spoke to Abel. That's the next thing that happens. His brother. I'm just going to highlight this because I think it's important. He's not just speaking to another guy. No, he's an image bearer. He's talking to his brother. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Twice, this verse wants to emphasize the fact that this was Cain's brother. So, question about Cain speaking to Abel. Did Cain speak to Abel before they were in the field? Or did Cain have this conversation with Abel in the field? And you go, that doesn't matter. Here's why I think it matters. These follow-up questions give us reason to ask that. Was this conversation the way that Cain lured Abel into the field to kill him? Was this conversation even supposed to happen? You know, Cain having this conversation with Abel, was that the wrong thing to do? Like, is this what it means for God when he tells Cain, hey, if you do well or if you don't do well, for Cain to not do well, does it mean he's having this conversation with Abel? Is he already kind of, I don't know, messing himself up by having this conversation? All I'm going to say is this conversation before the decision to sin seems reminiscent of Eve and the serpent in Genesis 3. And I'm just wondering, are we supposed to see that connection? Are we supposed to see that connection? Is this conversation even supposed to happen? Is this the way Cain is choosing to not do well, and he's letting sin overtake him, and he's luring Abel into the field where he's going to kill him? Questions I have about this text. Hey, real quick, don't forget to head to AboveReproachMinistry.com to check out all of our free resources. All of our Bible study courses, devotional studies, Bible study workshops, Bible study worksheets, all of my sermon notes, and more. And while you're there, grab a copy of my book, Fruitful, or snag some church merch. You can also find all these links in the video description below. I'm also very excited to announce Above Reproach Ministry discussion groups, or ARM discussion groups for short. Head to the website if you'd like to see what groups are available near you, or if you'd like to start one in your area, feel free to email me. The first season of video teachings have been compiled into a group study for you and other believers to dive into together. And in the months to come, I hope to have all 9 seasons of these video teachings compiled into group studies for y'all to dive into together. We hope this encourages you to meet and grow with other believers to dive into the scriptures as the body of Christ. Well, that is all I have for you. Let's jump back into the message. Also, right after God speaks to Cain, Cain says nothing. He's silent. The next thing he does is he goes to speak to Abel instead of talking to God. Instead of having a conversation with God, he goes and talks to Abel. Is that revealing something deeper about what's happening in this story? Is that revealing or emphasizing anything in particular? Should Cain have taken, voiced and expressed his concern and frustration to God rather than having a conversation with Abel? Then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel? Because we know he rose up against his brother and killed him. Where's Abel? And we know that God knows. He's not looking for new information. I truly don't know. I have lost Abel. He said, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Pause. The narrative did not state that God was elsewhere or that he came to Cain, though that's assumed within the text. You go, well, God wouldn't just allow that to happen or be there. I just want to point out the fact that it transitions from God talking to Cain, or rather, Cain killing Abel, to all of a sudden, God is talking to Cain. Then the Lord said. Suddenly he's just talking to Cain. Is this intentional? When we compare this story with how God approached Adam and Eve after their failure in Genesis 3, is there something different that's taking place? And if so, what's the deeper point being made with the fact that God just suddenly is talking to Cain? And the Lord said, "What have you done?" The only person God told that to in Genesis chapter 3, just fact-checking myself, is Eve. Genesis 3. What have you done? Interesting. Never really caught that. But I don't want to get off track. I guess I will keep going. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. This narrative has God asking two questions to Cain. And you go, two questions. Well, the first one, he said in verse 5 or 6, why has your face fallen? Second one, where is your brother? I guess technically, this would be 3. Where's Abel? What have you done? So I'm just going to focus on these two questions. You're like, he's making this up as he goes. Kind of, somewhat. I have notes. These two questions. Where's Abel? What have you done? Those are two questions that God asked Adam and Eve separately. In Genesis 3, God said, Adam, where are you? To Eve, he said, what have you done? Now, in this narrative, both these questions are being directed at Cain, and they're combined. And I'm just saying, is that significant? Is this revealing a kind of digression or progression in the story compared to the previous story with Adam and Eve? Also, why does God hear the voice of Abel's blood rather than Abel's voice? Is there a difference? And if so, what's the distinction between the two ideas? And you go, well, the blood is an extension of Abel. You know, the lifeblood is the life of the person. Why didn't he just say, I hear your brother crying out from the ground? What does it emphasize when he says the blood of Abel? And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. It's kind of weird. Isn't the ground, first of all, okay, isn't the ground already cursed because of Adam? Genesis 3 told us that the ground is now cursed, but he says now you are cursed from the ground, right? And then here's what I want to highlight about the ground, okay? Cain is cursed from the ground. Also, the ground has opened its mouth to receive Abel's blood. Also, when you work the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. There's a lot of conversation about this ground, right? Seems kind of odd. But isn't the ground already cursed because of Adam? So what does it mean for a man to be cursed from the ground? Is it important to note that Cain is cursed from the ground, which is the same ground that produced the fruit he brought? Because the chapter, or what was it, verse 3, in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. Are we supposed to see those two ideas as being related? The ground he brought his fruit from is now the ground that has soaked up the blood of Abel, and the ground that Cain is now cursed from. Are all these ideas colliding? Is this giving us a clearer picture of why God rejected Cain and his offering? Also, in verse 12, he says, you will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. What does it mean for Cain to be a fugitive and a wanderer? And sometimes we have questions. We'll just keep reading and it'll get answered. But something to think about. Verse 13, Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Does this question indicate that Cain had no real sorrow or remorse for his sin? Because he's only concerned with his punishment being too much. It's greater than I can handle. That's all he's concerned with. Also, what does it mean for his punishment to even be greater than he can bear? What does that mean? In his mind, how does he understand that? And I think as we get to verse 14 in the next video, there's going to be a lot more questions that we have, especially when Cain is going to say something like, well, what if someone finds me And we're going to save that question for the next session. Make you guys wait a little bit. So, thanks for watching today's video. I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough here in Genesis chapter 4. Hey, I just want to thank you for all your support and prayers that make this ministry possible and help us to accomplish our mission. Your support makes it possible for us to create all the free resources we have available for anyone around the world. Our mission is to teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach the Bible themselves. So be sure to visit abovereproachministry.com for all these free resources and to support this ministry. And if you're a new believer, be sure to check out the new believer section on the homepage of our website and grab a copy of my book, Fruitful, while you're there. God bless you guys, and as always, keep moving towards Jesus.